Under Tim Waltz, Minnesota went from a pro choice state to a radically pro abortion state at the expense of pregnant women. In 2023, Waltz signed two bills that granted women the right to an abortion up until birth. Leslie Corby is author of Silent Suffering Poems of Pain and Purpose. Joining me now to discuss, Leslie, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about this. We're looking at a pro-abortion state as opposed to a state that just has availability of abortion for women. That's a huge and radical shift. It means taxpayers have to help fund abortions. It's a whole new world that taxpayers entered into there. Tell us more.
Sure. So you're absolutely right that there is quite a big distinction between a state where abortion is accessible and one that is functionally pro abortion. So Minnesota is moving, oh, has moved in the direction of being radically pro abortion and encouraging abortions as opposed to merely allowing them to be accessible within the state.
So now that Governor Tim Waltz is running for the vice presidency, we see a kind of a focus on him. People want to understand who he is, they want to understand his policies. And he's not really saying much. He's not taking direct questions from reporters. We don't have opportunities for people to ask him about some of these things you're discussing. So, these two bills, how were they received by the people of the state of Minnesota?
Well, it seems as if the rhetoric of the Democratic Party, I think, largely won the day. Prior to these bills, it seems there was some kind a little bit more balance as it related to the abortion policy in Minnesota when there were Republicans that could kind of counterbalance some of the extreme nature of the Democrat shift towards, again, purely pro-abortion as opposed to pro-choice rhetoric. As we know, the Minnesota Governor Waltz did not come in with a mandate in relation to this. However, I think with the rhetoric surrounding abortion, he was able to push through, well, sign some of these bills that Democrats were able to push through when they had majorities in the House and Senate.
And so there are a lot of things about abortion that don't come up in these kinds of legislation in left leaning states. A lot of statistics surrounding the impacts of abortion on women. Post abortive women have a higher rate of depression, self harm, difficulties with subsequent pregnancies, difficulties in their marriages. They have a higher rate of divorce and a higher rate of suicidality. But most importantly, they have a higher rate of difficulty in parenting children that they either had before they had the abortion and subsequent children that they give birth to after the abortion. These are the kind of facts that I think women probably would be well equipped with in the decision that they have to make whether or not they're going to terminate their pregnancy, because once they're pregnant they're already a mom. So I wonder if any of those facts were shared as they were running up to these two new pieces of legislation.
Most certainly not, and I think that's where there's a important it's important to understand the distinction between the healthcare rhetoric that Democrats often use in relation to abortion and the rhetoric of abortion as a human right, because those to some degree are in tension. If those facts you just listed, for example, are all highly relevant when someone's making a genuine healthcare decision. So to the extent someone were to view abortion as a healthcare decision, you would want more information so that informed consent can be given prior to procedure, particularly one that's as impactful as abortion. However, it seems as if Democrats are really heavily leaning into more pro abortion rhetoric, viewing the ability to terminate a pregnancy as a fundamental human right that can and should be able to be exercised at any given stage of pregnancy. So it's important, for instance, to look at how Minnesota has no actual limits on when an abortion can be performed. And some may say, well, third trimester abortions, for instance, are really rare, and that is true in the sense that they make up a very small percentage of abortions. However, they most certainly do exist, and according to data from the Guttmacher Institute, they are performed for largely the same reasons as other abortions, which would be primarily elective. So accounting for things like financial reasons or other socioeconomic reasons that have little to nothing to do with the viability of the unborn child or the health of the mother.
So, Leslie, what's interesting about that, the statement that the late term abortion is rare, they're saying it's a statistically insignificant number of late term abortions. But if you think about what a late term abortion is, you take a baby that if you just usher it through the birth canal, that baby is alive and viable, could be adopted. The mother never has to see that baby again. Instead, they choose to kill the baby for convenience of the mother because it's an elective abortion. It has nothing to do with the health of the mother. At that stage, you don't have to abort the baby for the health of the mother. There is no reason to abort a baby in the third trimester when in the third trimester they're able to be viable outside of the womb. And so then you look at the numbers. Well, a couple of years ago, the last reportable year for the Guttmacher Institute showed 850,000 abortions in the United States. Well, that's a number that has trended down until Roe v. Wade was remanded back to the states by the Supreme Court. Now you have 20% more abortions per month than you had before the passage of or the remanding of Roe v. Wade. So a statistically insignificant number, even 1% of 850,000 is still a significant number of babies being aborted when they could have lived. So I think that language also is really disingenuous, and it it doesn't help people who don't know those other facts. If they don't know the facts on the ground, when you say, "Oh, it's an insignificant number," they think one or two. We're talking about thousands.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, far more cases of late term abortion than the stories that are pushed to promote the the abortion rhetoric of the Democratic Party. So you look at what's put out, I would argue, for PR purposes in relation to the effects of overturning Roe v. Wade, and a lot of like those are statistically much fewer incidents of those type of cases than there are of late term abortion. And again, those, let's say there is a need for health of the mother or something, or sort of more extreme edge cases, that in no way really negates the ability to have laws on the books that ban, by and large, late term abortion, particularly in elective cases. And so I think that the messaging we're getting from Democrats is that they're very pro abortion itself as a procedure, one that can be performed for any reason or no reason at all throughout any stage of pregnancy. And from the bills that Waltz signed and that Democrats obviously pushed through the legislature in Minnesota, you can see that because of the provisions that they both added and those that they removed. So, removing, for example, measures to ensure that women have informed consent prior to the procedure, and even removing the coercion language that was in state law that barred coercive abortions is something else that was removed. It makes it pretty clear that the goal of the state is to ensure that abortion is not only something that's legal within the state, but something that's readily accessible, to which there are no barriers. So, moving again much more towards incentivizing and encouraging abortions rather than simply having them available in some cases, or particularly cases of danger to the mother.
Well, and that's the next step, isn't it? You're talking about the natural phenomenon that occurs in law where you have laws against something, you weaken those laws, and the law becomes neutral. And then you change the law so that it almost promotes it, because the removal of the coercion aspect means that young women who are underage can no longer press charges against someone who coerces them into having an abortion to hide sex abuse or rape. And then it moves into the promotion arena, which is what we see in communist China, where they've now ended the practice, but for decades they forced women to have abortions because they had a one-child policy. And so I mean, obviously we're light years away from that, or are we? I think over the past 15 years, we've seen some definite shifts in the way that Democrats talk about abortion. They've gone from safe, legal, and rare, something that they felt was a necessary evil, to the promotion of abortion as a right, shout your abortion, and even the Satanic Temple adopting abortion as their right. It's a sanctification ritual for them. It's something they openly admit that they want women to engage in, which dovetails in with Planned Parenthood's policy of 3 abortions per woman of childbearing age. That's what they hope for because it helps them with their bottom line. So, Leslie, what's the right choice here for candidates who are running against this type of ideology? How should they talk to people about this?
I think pointing out the facts of what the legislation that extreme states like Minnesota have pushed does. So, showing this provisions where things like coercion are removed from the law, or informed consent. I think that can go a long way towards showing that this is not really about the edge cases that are promoted in the media. It's much more about a legal regime and a cultural ethic of discarding human life, frankly, on a whim. So I think that pointing out the provisions of those laws is very important, as well as pointing to how the messaging does not pair with the idea of healthcare, right? So if you cared about healthcare, for example, you would want coercion to be included, right? You would want people to not feel coerced into certain healthcare decisions that are perhaps not in their best interest. You would want them to think through impactful healthcare decisions prior to making those decisions, as opposed to on the back end to ensure their safety. Right. So there's very few other procedures of this that are this impactful where informed consent laws are being rolled back. So this is clearly an issue of moral and ethical concern, and not a mere healthcare decision like removing a root canal or having the ability to consent to other surgeries such as, I don't know, an appendectomy, right? So that's kind of often how it's billed. But when you look at what these laws actually do and what Democrats are pushing in states where they have full control of the legislature and governor's office, such as Minnesota, you can see that those don't really pair together. And then, of course, I would say people who are running against this, candidates running against this, should really point towards the effects that this can have not only on children but also women who make this decision and may make it lightly. So you had mentioned women who may have regret, so on and so forth. Those are the kind of conversations that if you were promoting safe, legal, and rare, you would want to
Yeah.
have those conversations, right? Because you would want people to be fully informed and to make the quote
So we
unquote
have to
right.
jump here. Leslie, excellent analysis. Thank you so much for sharing with us today. Leslie Corbley, great to have you on the program. Coming up after this S&C fast break, we have breaking news on the Iranian terror threats against the US and Trump. Stay with us.